Greetings, and welcome to the Crossing Ball. This is your professor, Robert Henry, and I'm here to look at some debates and some analyses that were done just recently on YouTube. Let's see, we're going to be looking at Dyer clips. Jay Dyer, really interesting guy, actually. But we're going to be looking at some of his, we're going to look at one of his kind of live discussions with an atheist, a debate with another atheist, and then a debate analysis of Matt Dillahunty versus Jordan Peterson. So first, let's look at this kind of live discussion he's having with this atheist. Really interesting kind of back and forth. Definitely gets this guy. This guy's an undergraduate philosophy student, and obviously Dyer has a master's degree in philosophy. So it should be interesting. My master's is in theology, but I'll be getting a doctorate in philosophy and philosophical theology and philosophy here pretty soon. But let's hear what Jay has to say in response to some of the things that the atheist is making claims about.
My question would be, and as I was listening to you talk, I wrote down 3 things that I would like you to clarify, if you would. So when you talk about a set of things, and when you talk about relationships, and when you talk about complex sets, when you talk about the things, I assume you mean when you pick out objects in the world, what is the set that classes those set of things?
Okay, well, I guess it would depend on what we're talking about. So let's.
Well, I'm asking you because this is what you said.
Experience, as an example.
Well, I mean, so you said thing. Hold on.
Oh, sorry,
so, are you talking about objects in the world? That's what I assume you mean by things. You said relationships between those things in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what is this thing that you're calling a set of those things?
What is this thing that I'm calling a set of things?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, it's a set of relationships, as in like. Okay, because I guess what you're trying to say is you're trying to say.
Okay, so the set is the hold on. So the set is is the relationship.
Sorry?
Is that what you're saying? The set is identical to the relationship?
Well, no, because like you could have a bunch of individual relationships, and then a set of them is just a collection of relationships.
Okay, so when we talk about a series of objects, right, that we're calling a coconut or whatever, you're saying that that is a set of 7 coconuts, right? There's 7 of these things, and that set we're calling coconuts, right?
Kind of. I guess like so for example, if you're looking at numbers and you wanted to find an empirical example of numbers, you could find 7 coconuts and then see the relationship between them of 7 different entities.
Okay, so hold on. So you said the set. So the set is identical to the relationship now, in this case, in this example.
Here's one thing you need to do before buying anything online. Don't spend another dime on Amazon until you watch.
God, I hate when they do that.
I'm not sure I fully understand what you mean, but from what I'm hearing,
you said, I thought that's what you said. The set here, in the case of the coconuts, is the relationship between the coconuts. And there's 7 of them.
Right, that would be one set of relationships, sure, yep.
Okay, so 7 is identical to the material components that make up the 7 coconuts?
Identical is not exactly the word I'd use. I would say that's sort of like an instantiation of that relationship.
Oh, so there's a distinction between the set and the individuals, such that the set is instantiated.
Well, in the sense, like, yes, because there's like an individual example of it, and then you could find that example elsewhere. I don't think there's like
what is instantiated. Because you said you're a materialist.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not actually anything instantiated. I mean, in your mind, you might perceive an instantiation, but in the world, there's nothing instantiated.
Right. Okay. Sorry. I'm probably not going to be using like I'm only in like my bachelor's degree level of education, so my use of terminology might not be perfect. So I apologize for that. But in terms of like, I would consider these sort of relationships to be found within the structure of reality, within the structure of material reality, without a necessity for immaterial reality, in the sense that you can find empirical examples of these different
so
logical categories.
What is instantiated?
What is instantiate?
Mm-hmm. No, what is instantiated in the 7 coconuts?
The relationship of 7.
Okay, so the set is the relationship.
Sure.
So what's instantiated is identical to the objects there.
It's found within that structure, yeah.
Okay. Where in those molecules do you find 7?
So it's not the thing is, it's not an entity, right? You're not finding like an entity example.
Okay,
You're
so
finding a relationship between multiple sets.
you said instantiated. That's a metaphysical term. You said it's in the objects themselves. What is
in the relationship between the objects?
Okay, but
not in it's not an entity. It's a relationship.
Okay, so you're saying that the set is identical to the relationship between the objects.
Not quite.
Okay, but that's what you said, and then you said it was instantiated. So I'm asking you, what's instantiated when what's in front of us is molecules?
Right. So the difference is and maybe I'm not wording it.
So you think look? Let me ask it this way: the number 7 is literally identical to 7 coconuts.
No, not quite. But it's not identical to the coconuts. It's the relationship between the coconuts. It's not the entity of the coconuts.
I just asked you if the set was identical to the relationship, and you said yes and no. So what distinguishes those 7 coconuts to the right and the 7 bananas to the left, if 7 is merely a set of relations?
Because of their identity as separate, coconuts.
That's begging the question, because I'm asking you you said it's because it's instantiated. Yeah, but it's also instantiated in the 7 bananas on the left. But the number 7, you said the number 7 is identical to the relationship of 7 coconuts. So if it's identical, then it's
the relationship
different.
that could be found within sets of many different 7.
Oh, okay. So entities. It's now you have an instantiation that is not identical to the relationship.
Right.
Okay, so now you refuted yourself. Exactly. Because you said...
Can you explain how I refuted myself? Sorry.
Is the 7 coconuts on the left identical to the 7 bananas on the right?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Is the 7 coconuts on the left identical to the 7 bananas on the right?
No.
Okay, so how are they both, quote, 7?
Well, they're 2 different examples of a relationship of 7 different
okay.
items.
Where's the 7?
They're 2 different types of
Where's
items.
the 7? So they're instantiations of a type or a set, but you said the set was identical to the relationships. But I've given you 2 different sets of 7.
Right, so it would be 2 different examples of 7.
Okay. Examples are instantiations of something higher. Where's the 7? What is the thing that is the same thing between the bananas on the left?
I'm going to pause this right here. Let me just go over what's going on. So this is really good. I think this is a really good example of how Jay, I think, can make these arguments and distinctions so that atheists can understand the major problems with the catastrophic problems with materialism. Okay, so here he's outlining some of the major and incoherent, or better yet, inconsistent problems of materialism. For one, when we talk about relationships, complex sets, and sets of things, we are distinguishing ontologically between the things numbered and the numbers themselves. Now, when a materialist recognizes that the material, the things numbered, are not the same sort of things as the numbers or sets or characteristics or even concepts, then they must relegate these later things, or these latter things, which we usually refer to as metaphysical, to simply how our minds or brains categorize phenomena that's doing the perceiving. See, here's the problem. If we are recognizing that the things we perceive are subject to other things, so much so that we could not perceive them at all, then this necessitates that we are also perceiving and not merely intuiting, as in standing outside of the process of knowing in some meta-epistemic way. But we are recognizing these entities or phenomena as real. Now, if they are not real and just merely in our heads, then we are either jumping from meta-epistemology to epistemology. However, since we are, which means we're stepping from observing how we think to the thoughts themselves. So meta-epistemology is us observing or thinking about thoughts. And epistemology is the thinking process itself, or the knowing process itself, right? So since we are simultaneously observing these numbers, categories, concepts, when we observe the material, physical entities themselves, then we cannot be doing meta-epistemology and epistemology simultaneously. For if we were, then how could we distinguish between the physics of the real things and the concepts, numbers, etc., as mental constructs? If we are doing meta-epistemology, or we're stepping outside of our thoughts and thinking about thoughts, and epistemology, thinking about things in the real world that are being made known to us simultaneously, then there's no way we can distinguish between one set of phenomena as real, which are just constructs or convenient models that our brains create. It could very well be the case, like Pythagorean, as a Pythagorean would suggest, that numbers are just real things and the material stuff are merely mental constructs. So you see the problem here? If we reject things like numbers, concepts, and things like that, that help structure the physical, or that is the grounds for, for characterizing or for categorizing. If the grounds for that, which would be concepts and which would be numbers and things like that, which are metaphysical, we typically refer to, if they're not real and just in our head, and just a categorization of our head, then we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's not, because a whole set of things that we're experiencing, phenomena, which would be physical things, could very well be constructs in our head, and the real things could be the metaphysical. So either we're doing epistemology when we're observing and understanding things in the world, and that understanding is, and here's a big word that Heidegger used, which was equiprimordial, which means neither is the cause of the other, they're just there. Either they're just there epistemologically, or we start picking and choosing, and arbitrarily. And if we start picking and choosing arbitrarily, we can't say which one's which, and we're stuck in this materialistic versus idealistic dichotomy. So, and by the way, Husserl, for example, which was Heidegger's mentor and the professor that taught Heidegger, Husserl actually, felt and believed that we do actually observe numbers. He would probably even say concepts. So when you observe what Jay's showing, these sets of things, if you see coconuts, you see 7 coconuts, you're literally observing 7 in that experience. And since you're observing 7 in that experience, it's real. It's not just something in your head. Your head is the ability to or what's in your head is irrelevant, because what's in your head is just sort of the way of facilitating that perception. But if you're thinking about the way in which your mind facilitates perception, that's a completely different function. And if you're doing that, then you have to distinguish between that and the actual process of thinking about the things themselves, which would include physical things, and yes, metaphysical things, which would be numbers, concepts, and things like that, which really do exist. If they don't exist because we adopt a naturalism, then we have some problems. All right, let's watch this next clip. I think this is great. I think Jay needs to do this more. I think clarifying these Platonic categories are really good, and I think that Plato is just as relevant today as he was 2,500 years ago. So let's look at this other clip real quick.
The molecules. You said it was instantiated. You said it was instantiated. You said it was. You said it was instantiated in
between the molecules, not the molecules.
And you said the set was identical to the relationship and is identical to the 7 coconuts.
Well, that's the thing. I don't consider it identical. I consider it that you have the entities, like, and you can have a certain amount of entities.
Okay, what's an entity? Okay, so this is metaphysical language. Where do you get a justification for all this metaphysical baggage that you're using here? Entities?
Okay, so from my understanding, and to be fair, I still have plenty to learn. I'm still learning a lot about this kind of stuff. I would consider that the metaphysics, like I agree that metaphysics is valuable and useful. My question is to be, why does, like, I don't understand the need for immaterial things.
Okay, is the number 7
the structure of reality?
Is the number 7 in my head identical to number 7 in your head?
Here we go.
This game, you're not ready.
All right, let's get past that.
No, because we have two different experiences of that relationship.
Okay, so what is the common thing between the two experiences?
Yeah,
exactly.
The sort of like
this
rule
is what
you see within
you can't
every time we experience.
That's not an answer. That's not an answer. What is the common thing between what's in my head and your head, since you just said they're different? But you said 2 minutes ago that we're both talking about the same number 7. This is Philosophy 101, Plato. Did you take a Plato class?
I've read some of Plato, not enough to.
So Plato 101 would be one in many. Do you know about the problem of the one in many?
No.
All right. So you got cheated in your education. You got sold a bill of goods, and you didn't learn the basics. I'm not.
Actually, that's a good point too that Jay's making. That is Philosophy 101, the one in the many. That's like, you should be learning that on day one in philosophy. That's probably one of the most significant the earliest significant problems that comes up in philosophy. The pre-Socrates were talking about this. How do we combine all of these essences into one? We have many things. We have one thing. We have an essence that gives being to all of these other things that are different from that being. It's a big problem. A lot of people don't think about it. They think it's just some sort of word salad, but it's not word salad. This is a legitimate, significant problem in philosophy, and Jay is right to point this out. So here's another important point that's made. Jay asks if 7 is in his head is the same as the 7 in Jay's head. Of course, the materialist must say it is that the 7 in Jay's head is the same as the 7 that's in this atheist's head. He has to admit that, but the materialists must say this even though they have no way of confirming this. Now, one strategy employed by materialists is that since all brains have an identical design, then they will simultaneously produce the same concept. So the idea is that since Jay's brain was designed the same way as this atheist's brain, and design being a term which is applied to natural selection, obviously, since they were developed that way, and the design being that sort of impetus of natural selection, since they're designed the same way, they're going to produce the same sorts of things or the same things. So these concepts have some sort of reliability or consistency. So now so that's that one strategy. So that all brains will have identical design, then they will simultaneously produce the same concepts, such as a number or the concept of tree. I mean, that's a big thing between the one and the many. We always talked about trees and tree-ness, the ness. However, the problem here is the meta-ontological presumptions of the structure of reality. Meta-ontological just means that we are looking at ontology outside of ontology. I know that's kind of a strange term, but it essentially means that what's the basis for reality? What's the basis of being? Going outside of being to understand being, right? Kind of strange, but that's kind of what we're trying to do here. There are presumptions of the structure of reality. That's what meta-ontology does. You presume something about the structure of how reality exists. And these do not have concepts. And this would immediately negate, or one could say there would be a defeater for, the idea that our minds produce true statements about the nature of reality, since we are using concepts which materialist admits are only strategies of understanding the world and not really existing structures or categories in the world. In other words, concepts, numbers, all of these sorts of things don't really exist in reality. They're kind of epiphenomenal in the mind. Now, and so even if the naturalist were to demonstrate that, let's say, Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism didn't show that our minds cannot produce the statements about reality, the fact that concepts cannot exist in the world outside the mind necessitates that our recognition of common design of our minds further necessitates that concepts exist really in the world to instantiate this commonality of design. So concepts have to exist in the world, not just in our minds, in order to instantiate this structure that allows for a common design, which would be even in the case of natural selection, because when we're looking at natural selection, we're looking at a process that we can observe, and that process is founded upon a concept. And so our minds could not produce a true statement about the world because concepts cannot merely be in the mind to evaluate how material or materiality actually functions, since matter needn't conform to our minds, minds expect it to, since concepts are for our sake. Therefore, concepts from a materialistic perspective are for our sake. They're heuristic, and they're not indicative of a really existing system that matter must adhere to. So, accordingly, concepts would not force their structure on matter. And since matter doesn't need to conform to the concepts that we're applying to them, there's no way we can develop an idea or a concept about the way the world is, so that we can understand how our minds developed, right? That's why the transcendental argument, as we'll talk about a little later, that Jay Dyer appeals to, is really important, right? So let's go to the next clip. So this is really good stuff. What Jay's doing here, I think, is an excellent strategy. I think he's brilliant when it comes to using this strategy, and I think that if more apologists appeal to this, like I think he has an analysis of the debate between Bahnsen and Stein, and Bahnsen, as he rightly points out, completely eviscerates Stein. And Bahnsen, of course, is a presuppositionalist. We'll talk a little bit more about what presuppositionalists are. But let's look at this next clip. Here's some issues, though, I have with some of Jay's strategies. He is engaged in a debate with TJump, or Tom Jump, and they're talking about the existence of God and worldviews. So here's a little bit of, okay, Jay has just given his his position. He's about the transcendental argument, and then this is Tom's response.
A meta level claim about the possibility of knowledge claims. So these preconditions are things like universals, abstract concepts, the status of objects, the identity of objects over time, the principle of induction, the external world having a reality to it that's not just simply mental, that there is a self that underlies all of our perceptions. All of these things are not reducible to matter. They're not, in other words, it would lead to an absurdity reductio to reduce all of these preconditions to matter. And so therefore they do have some ontological existence, some real existence. And so the only possible way to explain how all of those interlock or cohere, numbers, laws of logic, the things I listed, is if there is a God who grounds them and is the justification for those things. So basically I'm saying that there are transcendental categories or preconditions, and the argument for God's existence is that he is the only possible justification or ground for those things. So that is the transcendental argument.
Mr. Jump, would you like to?
Okay, before Tom responds, let me just give you kind of a background to this. So Jay offers in his opening an argument for God based on what is referred to as the transcendental argument. I'm not sure who first developed this. I'd like to look into it to see who kind of first coined the phrase. If anyone knows, I'd be happy to hear in the comments. But it sounds a lot like the Kantian tradition of transcendentalism. Now, this tradition, this Kantian tradition, is seen throughout the philosophical sort of project in Germany, particularly. So we see figures adopting this, such as Fichte, Schilling, Hegel, Schleiermacher. We have Husserl, Dilthey, Heidegger, Gadamer, Habermas. Many of these pioneers of what we would see as continental philosophy. And I think that an appeal to continental philosophy, and I'm not going to discuss the distinction between continental and analytic here, but ultimately the grounds for continental philosophy, which I think was poisoned by postmodernism, but that's another issue, is where we're getting a lot of this transcendental argumentation. But either way, it's an effective argument. And oftentimes it's equated with presuppositional apologetics, such as starting with Van Til and continued with Bahnsen, who, in my opinion, was by far the most articulate and effective advocate of this style of argumentation. But ultimately, atheists generally dismiss presuppositional style because they don't understand it generally. I do not, and of course they state that the presuppositional arguments don't offer evidence. They're undermining evidence, maybe, or but what they're addressing is not evidence per se, but rather the basis for what would account for evidence. I do not like using this label, presuppositional. I think adopting the Kantian tradition, particularly in line with phenomenology, delivers a better way to address naturalism, which grounds its position on far shakier grounds than theism, and admit evidence, unlike presuppositionalists, which in a Kantian tradition, you can use evidence, it's fine, right? Where presuppositionalists are like, I'm not going to talk about evidence. We can talk about evidence, but we have to demonstrate that that evidence is best understood with the presupposition of something like Heideggerian phenomenology rather than Comtean positivism. And if you manage to show that a lot of these modern atheists, particularly new atheists, have surreptitiously adopted Comtean positivism, or the idea that positive statements about reality can only be related to the natural sciences, and all metaphysics is an outdated form of natural science, and that was Auguste Comte's position, which is I would say it's a completely absurd position, but we could definitely argue that. It's arguable. But the point is if they're basing their evidence on Comtean positivism rather than something in the Kantian tradition, that would be a problem. And that needs to be addressed. True. But I don't like the presuppositionalist style and commitment to ignoring or disregarding evidence. I think it just needs to be shown, yes, you can admit evidence, it just has to be understood that evidence has to be grounded in something.
Mr. Jump, would you like to respond to that, or?
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify, so you're saying that all of the experts in all of those fields who wrote the books on literally all of those topics that you mentioned, they're all wrong. All of their worldviews, when the majority of which are atheists, non-religious people, they have some logical contradiction in their worldview.
That's completely irrelevant.
Okay, so here Tom suggests that the majority of experts in the field reject transcendentalism. Now here's where it goes off the rails, because I think situating a claim within the context of others' opinions offers strength to a claim. Combing the inductive likelihood of views such as transcendentalism is true by showing that this is a common way that we understand claims is stronger than merely pointing out ad populum or appeal to authority fallacies. Here, we'll see Jay push back ad nauseum on this issue instead of challenging the position that these experts have demonstrated that transcendentalism, or in the idea of theism, is wrong. But the poll Tom is referencing is about what are the philosophical views of professional philosophers, and how do these views change over time. The 2020 Phil Papers survey, the one that Tom is referencing, surveyed around 2,000 philosophers on 100 philosophical questions. The results provide a snapshot of the state of some central debates in philosophy, review correlations and demographic effects involving philosophers' views and reveals some debates in philosophers' views over the last decade. Only about 900 respondents actually answered the questions. This is from a secular liberal university. And even with that, around 66% said they were atheists, and around 33% were either theists or other. But I doubt the atheists, even the 66% from this small sample, I doubt they would even say that, yes, we philosophers have discovered there is no God. This is not a consensus. The sample size is too small, it's cherry-picked, and above all, contentious at best. So let's see Jay's response.
Into a formal argument. You're appealing to authority.
It's just a question. So no, it's not actually what I'm doing at all.
Well, there are plenty of authority.
Stop, Jay. Let me finish the question.
There are plenty of authorities who share my view.
No, actually, there aren't. The consensus view is against everything you just said.
Well, he's wrong right there, because he said that Jay said there's plenty that share his view, and he says no, there's not. Well, we have at least 30. Well, some percentage from the 33%, even from this small cherry-picked sample, that would agree with Jay. So it's not 100% consensus, as Tom seems to be fallaciously suggesting. But let's continue.
So there might be a few.
Well, you're going to arbitrarily limit which disciplines you
No, I'm going to take the majority.
I could give you a host of continental philosophers, analytical philosophers.
Jay, stop interrupting. So the consensus of experts, the vast majority.
There is no.
There is.
Why there isn't.
Yeah, there is.
It's total bullshit. You start the argument with bullshit.
Stop. There is a paper that literally asked for the consensus on these topics. The field surveys paper, where they did actually do this. Yes, that's a consensus.
That means nothing in a formal debate.
You said
you started your apologetic is a fallacy.
Why are you still interrupting? Stop. You said
because you're not even making arguments.
All right, let him. Hold on, Jay. Jay, let him get in there. Let him get in there. I'll definitely give you all your time. Go ahead, Mr.
So Jay said there was no consensus. I just proved him wrong on that. There's literally
a paper is not consensus.
Jay has his head up his ass. So a consensus is what the vast majority of the experts in the field agree on.
Again, this is just one poll from a cherry-picked small sample. It's not a meta-analysis, so that's another problem. If we had a meta-analysis of many surveys and we could get some sort of consensus, as Tom is saying, but even again, this is not an area where you can get a consensus, as he seems to be suggesting. This is not. See. So there is not a consensus, and I'm confident these experts would admit that it isn't a consensus, but a view that they hold, which is not confirmed, or that can be confirmed using the methods of science. This consensus is not in relation to an area that they are qualified to make this particular observation, being, that there is or isn't a God. They can't say that. They're probably just as many experts in the relevant field that would support the transcendental claim and the claim of theism. So again, it's a cherry-picked, it's not a meta-analysis. There's all sorts of problems with Tom's view that this is a consensus, right? So let's continue.
And there is a paper that polls the vast majority of experts, and so they do agree on this. So there is a consensus. That is literally what consensus means. And all of the majority of people who wrote the books on every one of these topics he mentioned.
It wouldn't even matter if that's true. It's a fallacy.
Why are you still
It wouldn't matter if it's true. It's a fallacy.
No, it's not
you can't make fallacies.
That's not a fallacy, Jay. What fallacy
is
that,
a
Jay?
fallacy. It's called appeal to consensus, appeal to authority.
Hey, moron. Phil Survey's paper, just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia.
Is appeal to consensus
and
appeal to
Jay,
authority
you have to shut up and let me correct you.
Is it a fallacy?
No, it is not a fallacy. No, it is not a fallacy.
Yes, it is. It's a basic fallacy. Appeal to consensus, appeal to expert is a fallacy.
Jay, shut up and let me correct you. So Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, fallacies. Number 9, number 10. Number 9 is the appeal to authority. It is only a fallacy if it's a false authority. If it's not a false authority, it's not a fallacy.
No,
number 10.
That's not the only case. That's not the only case. This is a formal argument.
No.
It's
Jay,
a formal argument.
This is a fact. It is not a fallacy.
No, it's not. It's not in a formal argument. You can't appeal to informal fallacies.
Can you just mute him so I can just complete my statement?
Go ahead. Let him get in, because I can see that's going to be a point of contention. Let him get his full statement in. I'll let you respond, Jay. Go ahead.
Again, is not a fallacy for anyone in philosophy. So obviously Jay just doesn't.
Yes, it is. This is so stupid. This is based. You don't have basic
Can you
philosophy.
mute it?
This is
I
one.
can't. I mean, I don't mute people. But
Also, too, another problem that Tom is having is understanding that this is an opinion of these philosophers, not a consensus of this is what we've discovered about the issue of God, as if it's something that they can discover. Or that they can come to a conclusion about, like the speed of light or something. So this is laughable that he would look at an opinion survey. This is just them saying, the philosopher saying, if I were to say I'd call myself an atheist, but I'm not saying that there's a consensus on atheism. It's ridiculous. But let's continue.
But let him get in, Jay, because I mean he's
Gotta
gonna.
shut up. He's just got his head up his ass. He's just ignorant of philosophy. Like literally,
Well,
go
You
to
have a
any
master's in
course.
philosophy. You have no philosophy training.
Clearly,
you would know
I
that that's
just
that's
proved you
a fallacy
have
and a
nothing.
formal argument.
You
Do you know what a
can't
formal
shut up.
argument is?
You can't shut up at all.
You don't know
So
what a formal
All right,
argument is.
let
he's still,
Come-
like,
It
you're
has
gonna have to
nothing to
mute
do
it.
with appeals to consensus.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it right there, but let's just kind of break this down. Here's where Jay gets it particularly wrong. For one, he doesn't challenge the consensus, and second, he falsely accuses Tom of not presenting a valid formal argument, since this has an informal fallacy, not a formal fallacy. So the fallacy he's referring to, the appeal to authority, is an informal, not a formal fallacy. A formal fallacy is something like affirming the consequent in a modus ponens, as in if P, then Q. You assert P is true, therefore Q must be true. Assuming if P, then Q is true in itself. Or in modus tollens, one denies the antecedent. If P, then Q, not therefore not P. So basically, if you do not, if you are giving a modus ponens argument, and you, instead of asserting the antecedent, which would be P, and you assert the consequent, that would be a formal fallacy, because the conclusion cannot be drawn from the premises, which would be if P, then Q. That's one premise. The second premise would be Q. You're asserting Q. The conclusion cannot follow from those premises. Also, too, you have the undistributed middle in a syllogism. But aside from all of this formal jargon, logic jargon, ultimately what Tom was doing was not a formal fallacy, for it is possible to appeal to a popular view, not opinion, as in if one merely states, I am true, I am right, or my view is right because in this isolated case P is true. This is another informal fallacy called hasty generalization, which it very well could be the case that if somebody says they believe in God or something and a majority of people don't, then just because you say you believe in God doesn't mean that it's true. So a view being held by others does give us confidence, right? So it gives us a little strength in it. This is the basis for the truth of Christianity. The church fathers, the majority of apostles and prophets within the canon of traditional orthodoxy tells us P is true, P or Q or whatever, is true of Christianity. A particular, doctrinal principle is true of Christianity because the canon is the consensus of beliefs cemented by history and tradition, spoken by the consensus of the apostles, prophets, church fathers, instantiated in Scripture, and the writings of early church fathers serves as the interpretation or the interpretive lens of Scripture, which gives us the appropriate hermeneutics, which in this case, Jay is right to stick with his Orthodox faith, since it's based on the Greek tradition, which was the closest interpretation, in my view, to the actual words of Christ, corrupted by some Latin translations. But be that as may, ultimately, this is where we see Jay simply stating a fallacy. It's an informal, and the argument is not invalid, it's just a bad argument. And Jay offers a bad response. So instead of just continually saying, that's fallacy, that's not a formal argument, I think Jay would have probably done a lot better if he would have just simply stated, no, that's not a consensus, and demonstrated that this paper that he was citing was not an accurate depiction of a consensus in philosophy. All right, let's go to the to Jay's analysis of the Jordan Peterson debate. So let's Okay, so let's hear a little bit about what he has to say about this.
Probably may not be supernatural.
Okay, well, before we listen to that part, in the debate, if you listen to his review, I think you should probably go back and listen to Dyer's review. But in his review, he talks about this debate. And I think the problem with Peterson is that he's trying to discuss, not debate. Does this suggest that Peterson is dumb? Is it intellectually useless? Or not an intellectual or scholar at all? I agree with Jay that he is sometimes presents sophomoric views on philosophy. That's true. Sometimes his philosophical views are rather shabby and uninformed. However, I would suggest that he is far more a scholar than Matt, who has 0 academic achievements, no formal degrees, nothing. But ultimately, it reminds me of one holding a plow and one holding a sword. This situation of debate between Peterson and Dillahunty reminds me of that. You have one person with a plow, one person has a sword. The latter, the one with the sword, well, clearly they'd be better in war. But the former, with a plow, is better for building gardens, for building, agriculture. Matt may be a better warrior, but if we have nothing to build on, then what are we fighting for? I think Peterson has done more for our current climate in an interest in God than any modern intellectual today. Yes, he is obscure. Yes, he is dense. However, he isn't incoherent. On the contrary, I think his insights give a firm foundation for religious ideas. So let's listen a little bit about what Jay has to say about this debate.
But I'll just redefine the word supernatural to mean any kind of mystical experience that you have on a drug trip. And by redefining the words.
Here he's talking about religious experience, and he's talking about how Peterson was appealing to psilocybin and all of these sort of hallucinogenic drugs that give people religious experiences. And through the religious experiences, there's a pragmatic effect of someone, quitting smoking or able to get over depression or something like that. So he's appealing to a pragmatic or practical use of these experiences and equated them with religious experiences. And Dyer's explaining that just because you have religious experiences doesn't mean that they are a reflection of God or that they kind of map onto what you would expect them to or argue for, or provide evidence for, anything that you would suggest that they would provide evidence for, particularly for the existence of God. So let's listen to what he has to say.
Therefore, it's happened. Okay, this is a terrible argument. Okay.
Well, pretty narrowly. Like,
no,
do you require miracle, like here and now? Something that defies the laws of physics? Or what's your definition of the supernatural?
So there is the natural world.
Yeah.
And then there are people who make claims that something is not part of the natural world.
Now, this is what we did in our debate with Matt, which is that we listened to Matt make this big fundamental blunder, and then we asked Matt to simply explain and justify his belief in the natural world, right? Which is a conceptual, meaningful, grand narrative explanation story that's told about what exists and doesn't exist, all this metaphysical stuff. And then Matt says, you can't do metaphysics. Oh, thank you, Matt. You just conceded everything right there. Now, Jordan is lost. He doesn't do or catch any of this.
That it has some...
He could have just nailed him right there. And there's another point in the debate where he could just nail Matt on metaphysics, and he doesn't do it. He gets really close.
External supernatural origin. Those are the claims that I don't see how we can make any sort of epistemologically sound confirmation of.
Again, Matt is correct to ask Jordan for epistemologically sound arguments. Correct. And Jordan is not giving them. However, Matt can't justify epistemological soundness because Matt can't justify or explain or ground epistemology at all. Pragmatic appeals are not a justification.
I'm fine with accepting that people have these experiences. I've been, I was, for many, many years, fundamentalist Southern Baptist, and I remember standing in church and feeling what I would have described at the time as the Holy Ghost, sweeping through me. Now, many years later, I look back at that and I say, why did I describe this particular experience?
This is actually an interesting point that I will concede to Matt, that the religious bases that most evangelicals have as to why they believe is emotional appeals, emotional moving experiences, which are not the reason to believe in a religion. Now, those might accompany your religious belief or experience. But this is the reason that evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, charismaticism don't hold people, is because the whole of the religious experience is grounded in these emotional highs and lows and roller coasters, right? Jesus, we love you so much that we love you more, and we love you even more than much before. 20,000 times if we repeat this worship song, we'll be less gay.
This is actually funny.
Hey, and we'll love you more. Right. On and on and on and on and on. Just gibberish. Praise and worship gibberish, right? It's all nonsense. It's nothing. Why? Because it's all about emotions. That's not what the religious experience is. And that's why I appreciate the Orthodox tendency to ignore the emotional experiences, the dreams, the vision. Prelest is the danger here. When the religion is grounded in prelest, you are on shifting sands, you see. So, correct, Matt. Your feeling of the quote spirit blasting through you was probably a case of gas or lentils or who knows what, right? It wasn't the spirit, because that's not what we say the spirit is. What does Paul say evidence of the spirit is, right? A changed life, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, good. Living and following the 10 Commandments is the...
Okay, so here's a couple things I would like to say about religious experience, where Jay seems to be in agreement with Matt that religious experiences or experiences of the Holy Spirit or whatever are not necessarily a good evidence for God or for a supernatural realm or what have you. Here, Jay and Matt suggest that since there are a variety of religious experiences, we can't trust experience itself or religious experience itself as providing a grounds for there being God or there being a spiritual realm. Peterson is interested in showing that religious experience is indicative of non-materialistic experience that transcends the material, the natural. However, Jay pushes back on this since many charlatans, many religious people, have appealed to these experiences that could be best described by gas, by sex, etc. However, what Matt and Jay fail to consider is that this may be an example of an experience that is not a material epiphenomenon, but indicative of a real spiritual world. For instance, William James's work, Varieties of Religious Experience, demonstrate that these experiences, which are normal, they're ordinary, are not merely responses of the brain to stimuli, but indicative of something else. Why can't the feeling of sex be indicative of a spiritual experience? I'm not suggesting that has a universal revelatory force that's revealing something for all people, but it certainly points to something transcending the material world. Otherwise, we concede to Matt's materialism. Here's a little note on religious experience that I've noticed. Often, this is viewed as a subjective and thus unreliable form of evidence. There's a great deal of misunderstanding about religious experience. Janet Martin Soskis pointed this out in her book, Metaphor in Religious Language, which I highly recommend you read, that there are two types of religious experience, pointed and diffused. I actually brought this up to her, and she totally forgot about writing or pointing this distinction out. She even claimed that that she hadn't written it, and then I quoted it, and she was like, oh my gosh, it was in my book. But she makes a distinction between two types of religious experience. The former is a personal experience, and the latter is universal religious traditions. The former, which would be pointed, would be something like, I felt God on this mountain. Naturally, this can be characterized as subjective and possibly the result of some other cause, such as emotional responses. However, diffused experience, or diffused religious experience, is objectively situated. And yet, although it is objective, the atheist complains it doesn't map onto reality. However, when the two sorts of experiences are in tandem, pointed and diffused, pointed experience offers the mapping on to where God is observed by a community of speakers. This is Wittgensteinian language of a community of language that serves as the ground for epistemic phenomena's class of authentic ontological phenomena as being in the world, as well as the objectivity of religious tradition of a larger community that offers a consensus to the experience. So in other words, you have the pointed, which is I felt God, and then when that is within the context of a community, a religious community, religious tradition, like for example Jay's the Orthodox Church, then that gives it a universality. Without the pointed experience, without the I felt God here, you wouldn't have it mapped onto reality because it's just a concept, according to Matt. However, without the conceptual and the universality of it, then it could be just like, as Jay said, just a bit of gas you have in your motion. Another distinction, one I developed some years ago in a novel I wrote, is that of sharp and blunt experiences. The former are those that are acute, clear, and in focus. Like a sharp experience would be something of a physical thing that we observe. Blunt are those that are universal, they're global, they're subtle, like concepts. And it makes sense, being that according to Aristotle, in his book on metaphysics, he says, just as light is to a bat's eyes, so too are the first principles to us. And so the closer something is to us, however we are, the more pervasive. But blunt is impressions on us. So if something's closer to us, it's not going to be as piercing, but it is going to be more pervasive. Likewise, the more distant something is from us, the more focused, piercing, and sharp it is. And so religious experience, just because it isn't sharp, doesn't mean it is something just in the mind. Concepts, numbers, and abstract things are all phenomena that are closest to us. We don't use them. They are not present to hand, to use Heideggerian terms. They are a part of us, like us. They are ready at hand. They are closest to concern or sorge. And so religious experience, through personal pointed experience, with a consensus of its diffused nature in religious communities and institutional instantiation, and the model of its likelihood of being blunt and diffused epistemically, certainly support its authenticity as a real experience and not merely something in one's head. Jay is correct that we cannot build a religion on these, and going back to Soskis's book on metaphor and religious language, I recommend it to you all. She makes the distinction between point and diffused. They should be grounded and diffused. So Jay is right that many religious traditions and modern kind of traditions are based on experiences, like the Pentecostal movement. Like, I felt God, and he was talking about how a lot of Christian music kind of is nonsensical. So one of the earliest Christian heresies was Montanism, which suggests that we constantly get these prophetic words from God through mystical experiences. This goes back to the first couple centuries of the faith. And some people have seen parallels of this with Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement. This is much like what Jay references in the Azusa Street. I think he speaks about it in one of his videos. The Azusa Street revivals that were a foundation for modern Pentecostalism and has done a lot of harm to traditional Christianity by grounding pointed individual religious experiences in themselves and not in diffused universal religious experience foundations of Christianity itself. In other words, if the religious experience isn't grounded in a religious tradition that is agreed upon, a consensus, going back to the term consensus from one of our earlier, one of the earlier debates he had. If you don't have that consensus, you don't have that universality, the Catholic, universality of all Christianity, then it's going to present a lot of really heterodox perspectives that are going to counter many of the teachings of Jesus. But all in all, religious experience does point to a God, even if it is not a good foundation for Christianity. I'd say all in all, Jay offers some elegant defenses of God. I would caution him in his insistence on fallacy hunting, as if he has found a modal hole in his interlocutor's argument. Also, I think he should recognize when we have builders of faith in general, like Peterson, and defenders of faith in a legitimate battle. So I think he should recognize that Peterson is not a good debater, but he's a great cultivator. I think he's cultivating the fertile ground that faith could spring up from in this modern post-Christian secularized world. So that's what I would say to Jay. So overall, I love it. Got some really good stuff. Unfortunately, there is some bad stuff. All in all, though, it's beautiful. Beautiful. Love it.